Russia tried to take Lyman.
Ukraine stopped it, not by accident, not by chance, but by planning, preparation, and a layered defense that turned a would-be assault into a rout. What Moscow hoped would be a decisive push became, instead, another failed gamble. Tonight we explain exactly why Lyman remains secure, how Ukraine dismantled Russia's plan before it began, and what this tells us about the war's current balance of power.
Lyman is not merely another town on a map.
It is a hub, rail links, road junctions, and a geography that funnels logistics through narrow approaches.
Control of Lyman offers maneuver, supplies, and a staging area to press deeper into Donetsk. When Russia occupied Lyman in 2022, it was a symbolic and operational gain for Moscow. When Ukraine retook it later that year, reclaiming Lyman became a signal that Russian momentum could be reversed and that the Donbass was not an open runway for Moscow's ambitions. That historical tug-of-war is the context for the October 2025 episode. Putin wants Lyman because, tactically, it unlocks much else. Ukraine defends it as a linchpin of the Donetsk defense. The city's railway capacity, even partly ruined, continues to make it a prize. Losing Lyman would have been a major step toward the Kremlin's declared objective of securing Donetsk. Defending it, therefore, is non-negotiable for Kyiv. Moscow's attack concept in this sector hinged on one classic and unforgiving problem in wartime movement: water. The Zherebets River stands between Russian staging areas and the approaches to Lyman.
In essence, Russia needed crossing capability, temporary bridging, and secure routes to move heavy armor, artillery, and supplies across the river. The operational plan looked familiar: mass forces at staging areas, build crossings, ferry armor, establish a foothold, then press into the city with combined arms.
On paper, that is a textbook river crossing offensive. In reality, it is a complex, vulnerable operation, and Ukraine made sure it never reached the on-paper stage. 2 points are vital. First, river crossings expose engineers and bridging equipment to observation and strike while they are relatively immobile.
Second, bridging is time-consuming and logistically demanding. It creates a fixed target window.
That's the window Ukraine exploited. The first ingredient in Ukraine's success was intelligence and surveillance.
Across this war, the Ukrainians have layered reconnaissance platforms, from manned aircraft to drones, to human observers and electronic surveillance. That combination gives Kyiv situational awareness over approaches, river banks, and staging areas. In the days before the planned assault, Ukraine's forces detected the accumulation of bridge building materials and engineer activity.
Those signatures are visible: concentration of vehicles, presence of specialized equipment, changes in local traffic patterns. Once identified, targets become vulnerable.
Ukraine did not wait for the pontoon bridges to be completed. It struck during construction and at the staging nodes that fed the attempt. Deny the crossing, deny the assault.
It's a simple, brutal logic, and it worked. Military operations are sequences of interdependent tasks. In the Russian plan, the bridge is the enabler.
Without it, tanks in tracked formations cannot cross with the weight and tempo needed.
Ukraine's decision to focus on bridges was not a tactical novelty, it was operational discipline.
Destroying or disrupting a crossing removes the enemy's ability to bring mass to bear. It works not because it destroys every piece of equipment, but because it collapses the timetable. Rebuilding crossings under persistent surveillance and strike risk imposes a delay that can be fatal to momentum. Ukraine used air power and precision-guided munitions to strike the bridging attempts and the equipment associated with them. The effect was to push Russia's timetable back, possibly by days or weeks, and force Moscow to reconsider whether the operation remained feasible. Precision munitions changed the calculus. When a defender can reliably target key fixed items, pontoon sections, ferries, bridging pontoons, engineer assemblages, they can inflict outsized returns on investment. Ukraine's access to modern guided munitions, fired from fighters and attack aircraft, enabled them to do just that: engage the crossing attempts at range, reduce Russian engineers' operating windows, and make the concept of mass across the river hazardous.
This is not just about causing damage.
It's about the psychological and logistical effect: delays, dangerous repair cycles, and the need to reroute or reallocate scarce assets. In short, the precision strikes turned a probable Russian operation into an impractical one.
While airstrikes removed the bridging capability, drones finished the job at the tactical level.
First-person view, FPV, attack drones and loitering munitions are cheap relative to the tanks and artillery they can neutralize. In the Lyman sector, Ukrainian FPV teams targeted moving armor, logistics trucks and artillery positions, items that would have supported any river crossing exploitation. The combination is crucial: large, expensive precision strikes to deny the crossing and persistent, low-cost drone pressure to attrit the formations that might exploit any opening.
Ukraine's small drones are the asymmetry that forces Russia to pay a premium to move even simple loads.
When FPV operators found tanks moving in the open, their attacks were direct, rapid, and costly for Moscow. Reports of high-value Russian systems being hit, including advanced tanks that Moscow markets as elite, demonstrate the leverage such systems provide to defenders when combined with adequate ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance.
Detect, strike, and then shape the battle space. That sequence describes Ukraine's overall approach. The arrival of the 52nd Separate Artillery Brigade at Lyman was the third pillar of Ukraine's defensive system, where drones and air power identify and deliver point effects. Mobile tube artillery sustains area denial. Artillery can be moved rapidly, fire with precision, and reposition to avoid counter-battery strikes.
In practice, the 52 Indies capabilities meant that any Russian grouping in staging areas or approaches faced a continuous, accurate cannonade that prevented consolidation. That matters because modern offensives require assembly areas where units prepare before a crossing. Artillery that can interdict those spaces denies the attacker the ability to mass. The brigade's systems, particularly newer self-propelled guns, combine range, mobility and accuracy, shortening the window from detection to engagement and making Russian massing both dangerous and visible. What made the defense around Lyman decisive was integration. Reconnaissance detected, air assets and precision munitions struck engineering capability in pontoon assemblies, FPV drones harried moving assets, artillery punished assembly areas and interdicted likely routes. This sequencing turned the eastern approaches into a trap. Any attempt to build a crossing invited immediate and layered punishment. Crucially, the Ukrainian approach was not merely reactive. Once the bridging attempts were identified, Ukraine exploited the predictability of the Russian plan.
Engineers building pontoons could not hide indefinitely. Tanks must move along defined routes. By striking these predictable nodes, Ukraine amplified the effect of each weapon system. The result?
Russian commanders lost their window for a coherent, combined assault.
War is fought in geography.
Rivers are not just obstacles, they are force multipliers for the defender when properly covered.
The Zherebets River restricts access options and forces the attacker into exposed approaches that are observable and vulnerable. Ukraine turned terrain into a force multiplier by overlaying surveillance and strike on the river's crossing points.
The geometry of the battlefield limited Russian options and magnified Ukrainian effects. If you understand Lyman's terrain and the constraints it imposes, you appreciate why Russian massing was both visible and vulnerable. This is a textbook example of how local geography, well understood and defended, can negate superior numbers.
The Lyman episode also illuminates a broader reality: Russia's logistics are under strain.
Heavy bridging equipment, engineer teams, and the fuel to move armor must traverse often fragile and interdicted supply chains.
Destroying bridging capability forces Russia to pull in more resources to achieve the same effect, a process that takes time and exposes those resources to further strike. Every day of delay erodes the attacker's readiness, morale, and material. That bleed matters. The Russian military cannot rapidly regenerate bridges, engineers, and the armor needed to exploit them without resupply, and resupply under Ukrainian surveillance is costly. This is a strategic attrition that compounds operational failure.
Striking expensive platforms like tanks and self-propelled artillery is not merely about tallying losses.
It is about the strategic cost of replacement and the domestic political effect. Modern battle tanks, particularly the latest variants in Russia's inventory, represent huge investments in manufacturing time and skilled crews. When defenders neutralize these systems with cheaper munitions and drones, the attacker suffers a double penalty: lost capability and economic pain. Every destroyed T-series tank or artillery piece is a resupply problem for Moscow and a propaganda problem at home. That is especially true when losses accumulate without commensurate territorial gain. War is as psychological as it is physical. When soldiers watch bridging attempts burn, armor columns halted and comrades taken out by cheap drones, soldiers' willingness to press forward erodes. That eroding cohesion feeds back into command decisions. Commanders must weigh human cost and likelihood of success. Repeated failures at crossing a river reduce aggressiveness and increase caution, and in an offensive campaign that hesitation can be fatal. At the operational level, morale influences initiative. Ukraine's ability to preempt and repel assaults reinforces defender morale and amplifies the cost of further attacks for Moscow.
Faced with repeated interdiction at Lyman, Russian commanders have three blunt choices: 1. Persist, absorb heavy losses, and attempt repeated bridge builds; 2. Seek alternate axes of approach elsewhere; or 3. Accept the stalemate and shift resources elsewhere.
Each option carries a cost. Persisting risks attrition that Moscow may not be able to sustain. Finding alternate axes may simply transfer the fight but won't negate Ukraine's ISR advantage elsewhere. Accepting stalemate concedes the strategic initiative.
Putin's political calculus complicates these military choices.
The Kremlin's desire for symbolic victories pressures commanders to attempt costly operations.
That political overlay will likely lead to more confrontations like the Lyman episode unless Russian strategy adapts. The Lyman story underscores a broader lesson about modern operations. Interdiction and tempo control can be decisive. If a defender can see, strike, and disrupt the attacker's critical enabling functions, bridges, assembly areas, logistics hubs, then even a numerically larger opponent struggles to achieve operational surprise. In contemporary conflict, the ability to deny and delay key functions is as valuable as holding ground. Ukraine's layered approach turns centuries-old defensive doctrine, guard the crossings, interdict the massing, into a modern, technology-enabled reality.
Modern defenders increasingly profit from asymmetry in cost. Small drones, loitering munitions, and guided small-diameter weapons can neutralize high-value assets.
That economics works in Ukraine's favor. The cost to manufacture or procure a drone or guided small bomb is dwarfed by the cost of the tanks and support equipment it can remove.
Over time, these mismatches impose a fiscal toll on a state attempting sustained offensives.
Moreover, procurement cycles and industrial production cannot instantly replace destroyed hardware. If Russia is losing high-end platforms faster than it can replace them, the strategic implications extend beyond the immediate battlefield.
Ukraine's advantage is not purely kinetic.
Open-source intelligence, social media geolocations, and satellite imagery all amplify Kiev's ability to spotlight Russian movements and to shape the narrative. Highlighting destroyed pontoon bridges or filmed drone strikes does more than inform. It projects competence and control, shaping international perceptions and sustaining support. In this war, narrative and tactical success reinforce one another. At the same time, Ukraine's transparency about Russian failures increases political pressure on Moscow, undermining domestic narratives about progress and competence.
If Russia intends future offensives to be successful, it must address the vulnerabilities exposed at Lyman.
That requires secure engineering capability, improved concealment against ISR, better air defense coverage for engineer nodes, and secure logistics.
None of these are quick fixes.
They demand industrial output, training, secure supply chains, and doctrinal change, all of which require time and money. Absent a doctrinal pivot, such as dispersal tactics, deception complexes, and investment in counter-ISR measures, Moscow risks repeating the pattern: build, expose, lose.
Lyman is a concentrated lesson in the broader conflict.
It shows how Ukraine leverages combined arms, ISR, precision munitions, and inexpensive drones to multiply defensive effects. It shows how terrain matters when matched with sensor coverage and strike options. And it shows the operational and political costs an attacker pays when artillery, logistics, and bridging efforts are visible and vulnerable. Successes at Lyman are not just local victories, they are cumulative indicators of a larger trend. The defender can now impose unacceptable costs on an attacker attempting major maneuvers.
What does this mean looking ahead?
If Ukraine can sustain surveillance, precision strikes, and artillery coverage, it will continue to frustrate Russian attempts to seize key nodes. Over time, the cumulative erosion of Russian equipment and the logistical drag of repeated failed attempts may force Moscow to accept a protracted, attritional posture, costly both materially and politically. For Kiev, the imperative will be to maintain supply lines, conserve munitions where possible, and continue to innovate tactically, integrating new artillery assets, improving drone production, and maintaining air defense around key areas.
Lyman is more than a single battle or a single river. It is a demonstration of how modern defenders can turn geography, reconnaissance, and precision into force multipliers. Russia's failed attempt underscores the interplay between technology and doctrine, and how deficiencies in logistics and exposure to ISR can doom even heavily resourced offensives.
This conflict continues to evolve, But if the events around Lyman are any indication, the decisive edge will belong to the side that best integrates sensors, weapons, and maneuver, and that uses terrain intelligently to shape the attacker's options. For now, that advantage sits with Ukraine. If you found this breakdown useful, share it, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because the fight for places like Lyman tells us more about the future of land warfare than any textbook ever could. For continuing coverage and source-based analysis, stay tuned.